Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, I thank you very much. I would also appreciate if you took a moment to follow it on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcast. Today is one of the most special podcasts I do each year, where I'm able to interview the grand prize winners of the Writers and Illustrators of the Future contest. This year it's for volume 39. And so I'd like to welcome as the grand prize writer winner, David Henrickson, and the grand prize illustrator winner, Dao Vi. Welcome, gentlemen.
Pleasure meeting you.
Yep. Good to be here.
All right. So I got all kinds of questions. So we'll just start off. So Dave or David?
Either one. I normally go by Dave.
Okay, good. So Dave, so can you give me your trajectory as a writer? Because a lot of people listening to stuff here who maybe are on the second career
Yes.
part of life. So which makes you very, very special.
Right. In fact, we were wondering actually if I was the oldest person to ever won the grand prize. I figured I had to be up there.
You're up there, but you're not the oldest.
Okay. Well, that's sort of comforting in a way. I'm actually 68 at this point in time.
We've had 72.
Okay. So I've got 4 years.
We're an equal opportunity contest.
That's right. Well, and that's I don't know if people know that, but you read blindly, so they have absolutely no way of knowing how old you are, what your gender, anything of that when they read your stories. So if you get accepted into the contest or win a spot, it's on talent. It's
all it is.
And so that's really it's really very nice. As far as my life trajectory went, well, I've always been really interested in science fiction. In fact, it has been my vocation my entire life, even though when you're young, you don't tend to think in those terms. But very quickly on, it was really the only thing I ever wanted to do. At some point, you start reading a lot of fiction, and then at some point along that pathway, one day you get this thought, maybe I could write it. And when that happens, it's a scary moment, but a light bulb kind of goes on in your head if you really do, have that creative urge, and that sets you off on, another trajectory. So that happened to me when I was about 12, I guess. And for many years, it's just, you're young. It's just more of a dream than anything else. But I did, you start writing little by little. I got interested in it by the time I got to college, where I was starting to write smaller things. I actually won a couple of minor awards at the University of Michigan when I was attending there. In '82, I'm really old, I was 28, and I applied to the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Workshop, which at that time was a 6-week workshop that was being run out of East Lansing, Michigan, which is not very far from where I was going to school, but it's 6 weeks out of your life. And if I had been holding down a regular job, there's absolutely no way somebody's going to give you 6 weeks off.
No.
But it turned out that I wasn't that indispensable to the organization, and so anyway, I went to the workshop, and it was mind expanding. It wasn't even mind blowing. It was just when you get there, it was like after the first day I'd been there, I felt like I'd been there a week. After I'd been there a week, I couldn't ever imagine kind of like not being there anymore, because it was just that altering of an experience. And so you really get charged up from that kind of experience. Unfortunately, I was still only 28, and you get a lot of theory pushed at you. Of course, there's any number of ways people say you should write, or they write, or whatever. And after that, even though you come out of that kind of program really charged up, I didn't. What I learned didn't really apply to me, and so in some ways it really hurt my writing, even though it made me want to write even more.
Right.
And so I got into a situation where one of my big problems was I couldn't finish things. And of course, what's one thing that the writers tell you is, well, if you never finish anything, you're never going to sell anything. No one will ever read your stuff. You can't give somebody half a story and say, hey, did you like my half a story? So I got to the point where, and this is where, life comes along and sends you down another pathway. I got to the point where I wasn't I wasn't happy. I wasn't being good to myself. And so I said, okay, well, you love science fiction, you love to write, but what's really screwing you up at the moment is the feeling that I needed to be a published author.
Mhm.
I'd make a say, well, by 30, I'm going to have something published. By 32, I'm going to have something published. But, and every time I missed one of those deadlines, I beat myself up. And after a while, I thought, this is really stupid. I'm literally, the world isn't making me miserable. I'm making me miserable. And so at that point in time, I decided, well, I will keep writing. I won't worry about selling anything, which is, of course, if I really enjoy writing, then that should be the most important thing. And I went off and I got another job, which is basically I fell into computer programming, which at the time was kind of a new frontier. It was interesting because most schools didn't even have computer science programs.
Right.
If you got a job in a programmer, literally you'd walk in to a place who's advertising, and they would see that you're reasonably intelligent, you're a warm body, you've got two hands, we'll teach you how to program. And so it was easy to get into the programming field at that time. And so I did that, and while still writing on the side. But of course, as a regular full-time job, it takes up your time. I ended up, falling in love with someone, and that takes up part of your time
Yeah,
as well.
exactly.
And right, but then of course computers came out, and suddenly there are video games, and boy, those really take up your time, especially if you play them with the person you love. So I did that for many years, and then having nothing to do with the writing, though, eventually I sort of worked up the rank of the programming, where you become a team lead, and then you lead a department, and I became an architect at some point, which is where you get to actually design the application. But then, of course, they throw you into management at some point, which if you're a programmer and you're creative, that's hell. And it's even more stressful. So I got to the point when I was about 55, I'm going to say, and I was in that management hell, and to the point where I was thinking about retiring early, even if I didn't have the money. And so I started writing again. I mean, seriously this time.
Right.
And again, this is going to sound strange for people who are younger, like Dao's age here. When I started writing, there were no word processors. I remember getting a nice portable typewriter for a birthday at one point,
Mm-hmm.
and those old manual keys, bang, 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 bang.
Yep.
And I didn't know how to type because at that time boys did not take typing classes, and I really regret that over the years. But finally, they came out with word processors, and honestly, I don't know how people like Dickens and those people wrote, because longhand, and for me, I need to write something. If I don't like it, I switch it around, replace words. It suddenly became much easier to write with a word processor.
Back in those days, cut and paste was really that. You'd have scissors on the paper, you'd cut it and paste it.
Or all the whiteout, or I remember having
Even pre-whiteout, like when Mr. Hubbard was writing.
Oh yes.
That's where the term originally came from, was cut and paste. That there was no whiteout, it was pre-whiteout.
Yeah, and so that's even further back, or even I don't know if you could actually get typewriter ribbons that actually had an eraser band in them. So when you wanted to erase something, you could actually flip a little switch, and suddenly you could go back and type. Anyway, it was a very labor and time intensive process. And when people would say, "Yeah, you're normally going to have to do 6 or 8 drafts of a novel," and you think you're trying to do this on a typewriter, it's so daunting.
Mm-hmm.
And so the technology really enabled me, and I'm sure lots of other people, to be actually able to write much more easily. So at that point in time, I started to write some more while I was still sort of gunning for my retirement, aiming ahead of that. And so I retired at 2020, virtually on the day that COVID started. It was really just kind of weird. And an odd thing that happened to me, is that you spend all this time working for your retirement, and suddenly you retire, and the whole idea was supposedly you don't have to do anything when you're retired, but suddenly you feel this driving urge to do something. And so it really began to feel like, even though I could sit there all day long and watch TV or go out and play golf or something like that, if I wasn't doing something important, I was wasting whatever time I had left. And so that's when I really decided that writing every day made me happy. And I started at that point in time. Finally started to get back into the idea of trying to get something sold. So I've been writing all these years, and I actually have a lot of stuff piled up, which is kind of like I've actually finished about 8 novels. I've got another 6 that are somewhere along the pipeline, and a whole bunch of other ideas which are just waiting out there to be read. And so now I'm back into the kind of get published stage. So that has been my kind of career
That's your
arc.
career. Okay, great. So thank you for that. Now, Dao. So you're on the lower end of your life spectrum. Just having entered the professional
Or am I
business.
in the lower end? I don't know which one. You've got a lot of years ahead of you.
Yeah, he's on his first career. You're on your second. So how'd your whole art, which is just brilliant. I love your art and the depth that you create in that stuff and the perspective. So your trajectory as an artist, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And it's just really cool just listening to Dave's story, just kind of hearing, his experience, and his career kind of go through it. It's really fascinating and inspiring. And my story is definitely nowhere near as evocative as Dave's.
Give it a few decades.
Oh yeah, for sure. Maybe when I hit my 70s, I'll be able to tell a good story like
the
you.
good old war stories back then.
But one of my first experience with art, I think, was back in 2011 when my family and I first migrated from Vietnam. I think that was when my cousin first introduced me to a video game called League of Legends. I don't know if you guys ever heard of that.
Mhm.
And essentially in the game, you have these like little cards of illustrations of like these characters, these heroes that would be displays. I guess you can kind of compare them as to like Magic of the Gathering cards or like
Right.
Dungeons and Dragons. And so that to me was kind of like my first introduction to digital art. And I was always fascinated by the way they were done and how they were composed and illustrated. But it never really occurred to me that there was somebody behind the scene actually doing and drawing these pieces of illustration. To me at the time, I thought, I was like, okay, they're probably just like computer generated somehow, or just like somebody behind the scene just like clicking a button and then boom, it's just there. And so like to me that was fascinating, but it never really occurred to me that you can actually do this as a job and get a career out of it. And as time goes by and as I grew older, my interest in art actually kind of fell short, and I began kind of losing interest in it, because I didn't really know how far I could take my art and where I could really go. Most of my childhood was just mostly, just sketching and doodling in the back of my notebook while, sitting in class and not paying attention and all that stuff. But that was the extent of it. And I didn't really, see myself going any further with it. And I think it wasn't until at the end of my high school years where just seeing all my friends, getting into their dream university and going into, their venturing off into their new chapter. And it wasn't until that point where I was a bit stuck and kind of lost, because it was at that time where I was rejected by most of my universities that I initially wanted to go to. I think it was that time where I initially
That's
wanted.
what you get for doodling and not paying attention.
That's
in
right.
class.
Exactly. Yeah. Looking back, that totally makes sense now.
We won't ask you what your GPA was.
Oh yeah, that's fair. But yeah, it was really tough. Just kind of the feeling of like being left behind in a way
Uh-huh.
that kind of struck me, and it was just like kind of put me in that panic mode. It's like, okay, well, I have to figure out something now, because I have nowhere to go, nowhere to really go off of. And it was actually not until after I graduated high school, it was the end of towards the end of 2019, and then right after that, the start of 2020, that's when everything kind of went down.
Yeah.
COVID happened, the pandemic. And to me, looking back, for me personally, I see COVID as sort of like a blessing in disguise, because just looking back, I think there were so many things that actually happened to me during COVID that not only helped reignite in my passion in art, but to also kind of get a sense of confidence and that uplifting in just my future in general. And I think a big part of that came from my parents, really, because I think it was until the start pandemic where I noticed that my parents, despite everything that was happening around and everything that was going on, around the world, I noticed that my parents were always they always had like a sense of peace and comfort, and that really questioned me and as to what it was, and just I asked them and I talked about them, and one of the things I mentioned they mentioned was through prayers and just praying, and it really like surprised me, and it gave me a lot of confidence and peace, and so that's something that I took up, and so just being able to kind of being in that space where you're isolated by yourself, kind of in that zone, and just taking that time to really like reflect really helped me to kind of find my own path again,
Mm-hmm.
and that was something that I was super grateful for. And so yeah, and so here we are
Next
today.
thing you know, you woke up and you're on stage getting a grand prize.
Oh
winner.
yeah,
So-
Right.
yeah.
all right. So, because part of the result of this podcast is where I want people to actually, see your art, read your story. So at this point, if you can, Dave, if you can just take a few minutes and describe your story.
All right.
Why should I read your story,
Really?
Dave?
Oh, yes. I mean, when you say it like that, I'm not sure why. No. So, well, this is a story that was long in the making. I actually had this idea for the story some 30 years ago, and the world, our understanding of the universe, where science fiction was at that time, is radically different than it is now. If you go back to that time, you talk about there's stories about galactic empires, far-flung stellar worlds. That was basically sort of a remnant from even earlier, when we didn't realize how hard it was to travel to other solar systems, how immense even our small part of the galaxy, not even the entire galaxy, just a small part of our own galaxy. When you realize that within just a few tens of light years, there are thousands of stars.
Mm-hmm.
But more importantly, how hard it would ever be to get there in any kind of reasonable time frame. And people at that time kind of ignored those factors because they wanted to tell a good story, and they are good stories. But as the further the more we know, sort of the further those dreams recede. It's like reading John Carter on Mars. They're great stories, but we know Mars isn't like that, and we know, so we end up taking a more realistic view of things. So one of the other ideas, so that's sort of the background of where I was thinking about the story, and I was always fascinated with the idea of an alien race, alien races that are basically, I mean, truly different than our own, not just superficially so. And for me, those things tend to be around issues of biology, of the way they reproduce, of their natural environment. And at some point, I got the idea of a race that was naturally migratory. That humans are very territorial. I mean, and a lot of species on Earth are. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they stake a section of land and they claim it, and intruders are fought or warned off or whatever. And I like the idea of a race that had no home, that just kept moving, and so they wouldn't have a territorial imperative. And to me, that implied that they wouldn't necessarily have a lot of the same triggers that humans do.
Right.
The natural urge to be aggressive, to have to go into a combative mode to defend what's yours. And so as originally, when I first got the idea 30 years ago, I didn't take it much further than that. But now we know a lot more about the universe, and one of the places where people have talked about the fact that there actually might be life are around red dwarf stars. There are a lot of red dwarf stars. They in some way they represent a very stable part. It's after a red dwarf star evolves when a lot of the nuclear fuel in the sun has burned away, and the star becomes smaller, dimmer, and quiet,
Mm-hmm.
in one sense of the word.
Right.
And generally, in those situations, I think we're starting to find that there's a lot of planets that still exist around those things, but they exist fairly close to the sun. which is not a bad thing because they're cool. So there's actually the habitable zone of those planets tend to be closer to the sun. What it basically ends up, you end up with a planet which is radically different than ours. In some ways, it's more stable because quite often they're tidally locked. I don't know if I'm getting too technical here.
You started moving.
Going in. I'll pull back a little bit.
Because it's,
anyway,
I mean, after all, your story is
you're right. So I'll
the white elephant. So
exactly. So anyway, they evolve in an environment where they needed to migrate on their own planet to survive unstable and violent conditions. And so basically for them, safety was escaping from that planet, and they took their migratory nature with them. And so now they sort of exist among the stars as separate clades of their people, basically traveling. They don't like to stay in one place. And they also have a two-phase life system where they're sometimes they're terrestrial forms, and other times they become modal. They actually drift away on the wind to find a new place to live. So this is kind of the way they see the world. And at some point they're traveling along and they know of us because we send out signals into space. We're not a secret to them.
I love Lucy.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, it's they often say that the first thing that people ever hear was the Olympic Games, with elephant. That's not really true because it's more complicated than that. But anyway, they know of us.
Yes.
Their instruments are better than ours. So they decided to come by and take a look because they're a naturally curious race. As they pass by, the Oort cloud, which is actually this vast cloud of material that goes out like 1.5 light years away from Earth, they actually wander into a planetoid. The odds are astronomical, but not impossible. And they run into this thing and it damages their craft. Now, they're in a situation where they've been traveling for decades. They can travel for a while longer, but at some point they need to find some place where they can transition into their other form, or they'll die. And so the only place they have to go is our solar system that we're close. And there are a lot of them because it's a world ship. It's
Right.
about at least as big as Phobos. And they're traveling in their modal form, which is basically the size of a large handkerchief. So you can stack a lot of them in one place as long as they're in that form. So anyway, they know they're in trouble. They know of us. They're a naturally peaceful race. They decide that they want to make contact with us and basically arrange a trade. So they're willing to exchange technology and information for a place to fix their ship, breed, so they can continue to travel. The only problem is there are 20 billion of them.
Right.
And 20 billion in a world ship is maybe doable, but when they transition to their other form, which is the size of a small pony, there's the problem. Where are you going to put 20 billion
small ponies
anywhere? And at this point in time in the story, we're just still beginning to explore the solar system, and it's going to take a lot longer than I think people think. So the time frame is about 150 to 200 years in the future. We do have a colony on Mars. We do have settlements on the moon. We're starting to mine Jupiter for the gases in the atmosphere. There's a fledgling society out in the belt. These are very, familiar concepts. But the problem is it's still very hard to get from one place to another. We're not yet at the point in time where, Earth and Mars are going to go to war or anything like this. But the problem is that humans are going to want this technology, and we're territorial. And we're all going to want this technology, but no one is going to be willing to give up the light with the resources. Where are you going to put 20 billion people? There's not room on that on Earth. The moon is in this time is rather provincial place. They don't want aliens. Mars, Martians would have to give up 2/3 of the planet.
So we got to make sure we don't get in. We got to make sure you have something that people are.
Okay, so I won't. I was wondering where I should cut it off. Anyway, so basically, this is the nature of the story where you get to meet the aliens. You're introduced to the quandary that humans are facing as how do we come to an arrangement with the aliens, because they're nice people, but when push comes to shove, everything wants to survive.
Right.
And so they're not warlike, but it's, they can learn if they have to.
Right.
So we have a vested interest in making a deal with them. Who's willing to pay the price? What will that price be? And what's that resolution? So
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there.
Good. And that story is
White Elephant.
exactly. And it's a very apt title. Good. So now, Dao, I guess first of all, we're going to talk about several questions about your art, which I like to do. But so you do computer art,
Digital art.
Yeah.
Correct.
So as compared to oil or
Mhm.
acrylics or something like that.
Mhm.
So how did you were you at home and you had your little laptop computer and first of all started off with your Microsoft Word Paint program and then build it from there? Or how'd you get into being able to do that?
Oh yeah, for sure. So my workflow when it comes to creating digital arts is I mostly work in Photoshop, so that's kind of like my go-to. And I would always carry around with me a sort of like a drawing pad, and in a way you can think of it as like a digital canvas. And so
Sure.
you just kind of have a pad that you have, and then you kind of have a stylus pen. That's what they call it. And then when you put down your pen, there's a cursor that will appear on the screen, and in a way, it will act like as if it's like a digital canvas. And so that's sort of the tool that I use when creating my digital art pieces. For the particular piece that I did for the last history, the process that was involved in making the piece was actually both the process of doing both 2D and 3D.
Yeah.
And so throughout the piece, you can kind of see that there's like a big, atmospheres and large space and environments. And a lot of that was actually achieved by me creating 3D models and 3D assets and kind of like placing them, putting them together in a way, kind of like putting Legos together, if you can think of it that way. But yeah, it was just so much fun just being able to craft and build my own world based off of the amazing story of Sam. And yeah, it's just kind of like inventing your own space, inventing your own world, and kind of putting that all together piece by piece. And
Yeah, there's a book called Art with essays by Hubbard, and he has different essays in there on depth and how you can create depth either with focal points, with lines, with the color palette to be able to know what makes it look like it's in front versus back, and what will collapse depth, what will create depth is gone over, as supplemental reading given to all the winners. And also one thing that several of the like B. Jackson, she was a grand prize winner for volume 24. She's now a judge. She says, I remember all these years, that art is a quality of communication, and it's got to achieve communication as the senior datum. It's got, what's your message, especially when you're talking about illustration, because an illustration tells a story. If it doesn't, then it's not illustration.
Right.
So that right there, that art that you've got is fantasy at that point because the story is fantasy. But do you do mostly fantasy art or science fiction art, or does it not matter?
So I actually started off doing fantasy art because one of the first intellectual properties that I was introduced to was Lord of the Rings. And so that to me was kind of like my first introduction to fiction art in general. And so I was always drawn to, drawing orcs and elves and medieval armor knights with huge spikes and all that stuff. But as I got more comfortable with, doing more concept art and getting into more fiction art, I started becoming a lot more interested in science fictions as well. One of the most recent IPs that I was introduced to, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, it's an IP called Dune. And it's just a great, beautiful world building with a lot of sci-fi elements that I'm a huge fan of. So, yeah.
Oh, good. So now on the story that you illustrated, why did you pick that particular scene? Because that's near the end of the story.
Right. Yeah. So I definitely don't want to get into too much of that.
Not too much of a spoiler, but
not too much of a spoiler. Yeah. But I think for me, when I first, read the stories, it's just, first things first, it's such a huge sense of world building that Sam has created. And I was actually talking to Dave when I first met him the first time. And I was just telling Dave about how, the story that Sam created, it just really immersive and kind of puts you in that space. And so initially it was very, very difficult for me to kind of be able to kind of choose, what will
There's
be
so much stuff in there.
yeah, yeah. And in a way, it was a bit overwhelming because you're like, oh man, there's just so much happening. And it's like, what, like, how could I best portray this story in one image? And, just going through that story. And I remember, the finale, just being really in awe of, the final scene where you're kind of introduced to this grand statue. And to me, it felt like it was kind of like a right moment to kind of portray, to represent everything that was happening in the story, because everything that was going on, and as you venture and as you journey through the story with the characters, it all kind of leads up to that one final moment where you're confronted in front of this sort of deity or this figure.
Yeah.
And so I figure that was
And
a
what
good
was
way-
that story?
The Last History.
Absolutely. It was just the thing that, I mean, I've been doing this for a while, writers and illustrators of the future. And one thing, because I was just meeting with a representative from Locus Magazine and from Galaxy's Edge Magazine. And I was just saying that, because I was being interviewed, like, so what do you get out of it? What's in this, with you? What makes this so special? And for me, it's how every year, because there's not, I mean, there's a variety of tropes, but every year there's such an amazing diversity of storytelling that comes in there. And then for illustrators, like we got winners from 9 countries this year. And so, we've got, Vietnam, we had Korea, we had China, we had Costa Rica, and several, I mean, it was 9 total. And what's amazing is like the styles of those countries quite frequently shines through, and it didn't used to be that, since Echo's come on board as the coordinating judge, she's like really opened it up. So it truly is international in scope. And because illustration doesn't have a language, and you can have somebody who reads English read to you in your own native tongue. So even if you can't read the story, somebody can read it to you, and you can paint it regardless. So we've got these winners from all over the world that come in, but they represent different styles of art, which I love. It's just, to me, one of the most amazing and rewarding things is just seeing how much art can be celebrated around the world. And Dao, with you, we had the Vietnamese TV was there, interviewing you. He was in the audience. When you were announced as the grand prize winner, he was crying.
Mm-hmm.
He was
No
so
way.
happy, so elated, so like, jumping out of his skin with so much, admiration, for you, but also for them, for the contest, that there's something exists that has no preconceived ideas. You can be any age, any nationality, any ethnic, whatever sexual persuasion, and it's just, are you a good artist? And there's no idea like it. Well, we got to celebrate Canadians, so we need to do this year. We got to do, Australia. It's not, the judges have no clue when they're judging. So when you won, and then we find out when they send in the judging, and we're tracking it, because for the 4 first place writer winners, all the judges judge, and the scores change, and Joni would come in and tell us, okay, so right now such and such is in the lead. Okay, this is in the lead. Okay, well, it's looking really good for this one here. And then all of a sudden 3 more votes come in and it changes. And with the illustrators, it's all 12 artists are up there. So it's constantly going up and down, like who's in the lead right now. And so when we find out, when they all come in, because they don't know who it is either, they just know it's number this, number that. So it's such a treat to find out. And then she say, okay, good. So this is the winner. And we find out usually a few weeks in advance, we find out who the grand prize winners are. And it's so amazing. We've had winners from all over the world. each year. So it's, for me, it's a real treat to have, this contest and just a variety of winners and the diversity of styles of art and the amazing, like, who could have thought about, white elephant as an story idea? Is like, wow, where'd that come from? Or these foxes, where'd that come from? And so all these, they're just so different, so diverse. So when the judges say on their, they send their kudos or their blurbs in, they say, yeah, I can guarantee there's something for everybody. And the reviews are coming in from, like Library Journal just came in while we were getting ready to start this workshop. They're saying that's great, and that goes to all the librarians. So that gets librarians doing it. And we had another Midwest Book Review said amazing things about it, that this really is the future of science fiction and fantasy. And it bears out because you see the success rate of writers and artists. So on your art, where do you're working now? You've got a professional capacity. What do you do?
Correct. Yeah. So currently, I am very fortunate to have been picked up by a film studios, where I just am so privileged to be able to create concept art for so many projects, and it's just been a huge joy just being able to work. And funnily enough, I was talking to some of the fellow illustrators and writers. To me, sometimes it doesn't really feel like work because I just get to do what I do every day,
Right.
but I'm getting paid on top of that, and I'm learning.
Uh-huh.
So it's just been a huge blessing.
Yeah, Craig Elliott, because he does concept art for, now it's Disney. He was in charge of Netflix, and then Disney got him back because a lot of the animated movies that you see, the big ones they come out with, that's Craig Elliott as the chief creative on that.
Right.
And it's just amazing. He's one I want to, if you're interested, to connect you up with, as a grand prize winner, because obviously you've got a job doing really well right now, but he might be able to provide extra tips for you, because he's one, I said, he's the creative director there now at Disney. He never entered the Illustrators of the Future contest. He read it since the very first book. He said, I wasn't good enough. I never thought I was good enough to enter. Yeah, his person now is the senior designer in the most beloved movies.
That's
that
amazing.
Are making hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
But he thought, I'm not good enough. And so now I want to address a message from first you, Dave, and then you, Dao, to aspiring writers. Like, you give me your story, but cautionary tales, things that if you had a chance to do it again, you'd change, and what you've learned along the way that might save others some unnecessary grief.
Okay, so let's see. Trying to think about, I don't know what to do first, cautionary tales or
whatever bubbles up first.
Okay, so advice. You have to persevere. I'm at the point where I'm starting to sell stories, but your stories come back a lot more often than they stay. And the markets are tight these days, so that's good in one way, bad in others. There's very high quality out there, but that means that you've got to write high quality to get published. So you really have to persevere, and you really cannot take it personally. And even saying that, I have to tell myself all the time not to take it personally. In fact, when I track my stories, I used to use rejected. Well, I don't use the word rejected anymore because that's a negative connotation. They get returned to me. And quite often they get returned to me. It has nothing to do with the quality.
That's right.
And that's something that people really don't quite understand, is that your stories did not simply fit what that publication needed at that time. They can't buy everything. They can't buy something and let it sit on the shelf for 2 years before they use it. A story that got returned one day might have been accepted a few months later when they suddenly did have a spot for that story. So, at some point, yes, you have to have the quality, but even the best story will get returned.
That's right.
And so don't take that personally. Don't take it as a judgment on who you are. Just keep writing. Another piece of advice is follow the guidelines. These people have an immense amount of material they go through on a daily basis. And this is one of those situations where if they want you to do something in a particular format, font, whatever it is, follow those guidelines, because they are going to have to look at 20, 30, 40 stories that day. And you don't want to make it any harder for them than it is, because like I said, there's a lot of people out there who want to get published. So listen to what they say, and follow the thing. Something else I guess I would really recommend is you have to, and this is probably the most important thing I think, you have to learn how to self-edit. So you're going to show your stuff to your friends, maybe a writing group. They're going to give you feedback. Some of it's going to be nice, some of it's going to be self-serving. But in the end of the day, they're not the one writing the story.
That's right.
They're not the one who had the creative vision that made that story happen. Only you are the person who did that. And at the end of the day, you have to decide when your story is finished or good enough to go send off. And keep in mind that there aren't very many quality markets out there right now. So I know that when I first started writing to publish again a couple of years ago, I would write a story I liked. I would send it out to, some of the top of the, the very top thing, and they would be returned. And in those cases, it didn't really matter whether, I don't even know if it was a good story anymore, because I wasn't following the guidelines. I wasn't editing it well. I mean, like typos. It wasn't polished enough.
Right.
And so what I would really recommend to somebody, if you write something, unless you're a Stephen King and like no one else is out there is Stephen King except for Stephen King, write it, put it away for a while until you can come back and look at it with fresh eyes, revise it again. It's easy these days with word processors. I normally do that 3 times before I think about sending it out anywhere. And you'll know if you take a look at it, and the first time you go back and look at it, it might take you a day to write. You may have all sorts of changes you want to make. That's fine. Put it away again, come back a little bit later, look at it. Now you have fewer changes. Eventually, it's going to get to the point where either you're not coming up with any substantive changes, or you're writing it a little differently that day because you simply feel a little differently. But either version is fine. And so at that point, you realize, okay, I've made this about as good as I think it needs to be, as I can make it. Send it out, see what people think. But if you don't go through that process, you're burning your best markets before your story has ever had a real chance of getting accepted anywhere. So, and it's not like you're adding, like if you try to do 10 stories, and let's say it takes you 3 months to go through that process for a story, it's not like you're taking 10 times 3 months and that adds up to 30 months. You're just taking your entire pipeline and moving it back 3 months. While that one's sitting in the drawer, you write another story, and then another one after. And whenever you go back to look at the first one, well, you just moved everything back in the pipeline. So you're really not slowing yourself down, but what you really are doing is giving yourself the chance to write the best story that you can with what you've got there, and also giving it the best chance to sell. So I'm much more sort of in favor of advice as opposed to cautionary tales,
Okay,
because
good.
everyone's different. So that would be my advice. Cautionary tales, you're going to hear a lot of writing advice out there from very well-intentioned people. There's all sorts of ways to write. There's all sorts of different kind of writers. You have to find what works for you. And we've just been in a week of workshops, and these people, and these are insanely successful people. I mean, really very successful, and they're arguing with each other all the time.
Exactly.
From 1 hour to the next, you can hear diametrically opposed opinions about stories, and that's very healthy, because we're not there to, have one method beaten into our heads. They're giving us this whole smorgasbord of possibilities. Listen, find out what resonates with you, and go with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yourself now, your turn. You're on, Dao. So advice and cautionary tales. You might not have a whole lot of cautionary tales because you're still basically a pup.
Yeah.
But at least advice, because you definitely had your own curve. So go ahead.
For sure. Yeah. And I think, when you, one of the things that you mentioned that really resonated with me with the story about Craig Elliott, how, just being one of the top designers that he is, he's always struggled with, overcoming that fear. And I think I resonate a lot with that. I think when I first entered the Illustrators of the Future contest and was, rejected the first time, or had my stuff returned back to me, it was that I was like, oh man, like this is, I'm never gonna do this again. It's like, oh man, they don't like me. It's like this is not good enough. And it was actually Joni was the person that actually reached out to me and encouraged me to try again. And
Wow.
so it's funny, yeah, because I don't think if it wasn't for Joni, I think I would just probably just like kind of let go and forget about it. And so I think, for me, it was, just learning to kind of let go of that fear, just in a way, kind of just let your art go and not having to worry too much about, oh, it's like, oh, what are people are going to think about it? Or, how, like how are people going to look at it and see it? And in a way, just kind of let yourself be in a space where it's okay to fail, and it's okay to have your stuff be returned back to you, because at the end of the day it's all a learning experience.
Hmm.
And that's and I think that's just what makes it such a huge joy, because everything is just it's just a big if you're able to kind of learn out of every moment that it is. And so yeah, I guess for me it's it's just like just have fun with what you do, and don't be too cautious about what people might think, and how your art's gonna turn out and stuff like that, and just enjoy the moment that you can, and yeah, just like not have let that fear come
Let me jump back in here too, because
Sure,
that really
sure.
resonates with me. Because one nice thing about either art or writing is that everything you do is practice. In a sense, you learn as much about writing something bad as you do about writing something good.
That's right.
So, and it's a journey. You're going to get there. And I think I know one of the things that always stopped me was actually fear of, this sounds weird, fear of success. Not that I would be big and I'd be, but the fact is that I remember the time this was about a long time ago when I was getting ready to go to Clarion. I sent out a story to Analog magazine, and I was scared to death because I thought it might be good enough to sell. And before, when you write something and it's bad, well, you figure, okay, they're going to send it back, so that's not good, but no one's going to read it and judge me.
Got it.
But as soon as it's out there and anybody can pick that up and read that and say, that's not very good or has problems with it, then that's that fear of being judged, and you really shouldn't let that hold you down.
Right.
I've actually taken a few art classes a long time ago,
Oh, cool.
and when they do is they sit you down like with charcoal, as they give you 2 minutes to draw something, literally 2 minutes, because you can't screw it up anymore in 2 minutes than you ever will. It will be the worst picture possible in 2 minutes. And then as the class goes on, they give you 5 minutes, and then they give you 10 minutes, and it takes you longer to screw it up every time, or get to the point where it's going to reach some level of good or bad, and that's after that you stop. So it was really astounding to me when they did that. They said, no, just take it. Okay, now throw that away, try it again. Just practice over and over again.
Mhm.
Learn a little bit every time. Get better. Like you said, don't be afraid of failure. Take criticism. Particularly criticism that makes sense. But again, you realize that not everyone's going to like your stuff. I think one thing that people get in their head is that what they're going to do is going to change the world. And a good story is a wonderful thing, but it's not going to change the world. One of the things that there's a writing exercise you can do if you have a bunch of people is, I don't know if we're out of time or
No, we're good.
okay, is you can actually tell people to make a list of their 3 favorite authors. There's no real criteria, just 3 authors that mean something to you. And if you ask people that, they'll say, well, what should I, it's not a test, right? Just give me your 3. You put all those lists together, you hand it back to people, and you say, which of these authors do you like, which do you not? And you just do this in a round circle. And you'll be amazed at how many people don't like your favorite author. I remember doing this, and Roger Zelazny was on that list for me. And some people said that the guy leaves me cold. How could you not like Roger Zelazny? Yeah. So
A prior judge.
and so the idea being that everybody's going to respond to your stuff differently. You're never going to please 100%.
You shouldn't try to.
It's pretty hard to even displease 100% of the people. So just do what's important to you and get it out there, learn from it, and let the world take it as they will.
Good, good. So Mr. Hubbard created this contest 40 years. He launched it in 1983, and it's been going now 39. Now we're in our 40th year. What, your perspective as an artist, Dao, what kind of a person, do you think, as Mr. Hubbard was when he created it, what kind of a person would actually create a contest and continue to endow it year after year after year for the aspiring artist? So what kind of a person would that be?
Yeah, and for me, I think when I think about Mr. Hubbard, I think it all comes down to passion. It's right. For me, it's like I do what I love because I'm passionate about it, and
Mhm.
I find joy and peace and comfort in doing what I do. And I think that comes in a lot of in ways where people tend to pursue and go forward with what they do, because I think passion it's a big part of it. And in a way, you're enjoying that process and you're having a lot of fun, and you get to share that joy with other people around you. I think that to me, I think that's what kind of makes it is so special and unique. And I think that's, yeah, what Mr. Hubbard's able to do. It's great. It's awesome.
Good. And you, Dave, so he was obviously one of the top-selling writers in the 30s in pulp fiction,
Right.
writing in every genre, 15 different pen names, because sometimes he was in 3 different magazines with different
Right.
stories, different pen names.
Mhm.
So as a writer, what's your perception of Mr. Hubbard as an author who's created this possibility for yourself,
Right.
39 years down the road, to have this opportunity?
Well, I guess I'm not sure I'm answering the same question that Dow is, but when he were talking, the words that came into my mind was vision and generosity. Vision to see into the future, and also to recognize the importance of that, but also then just the generosity to just pay it forward. And that's definitely something we've seen in the contest. Is that one of the things that really surprised me was how giving the authors who are in here talking to us are. I mean, they're going way above and beyond to not only help us for these few days, but to clearly be prepared to help us in the future. And I think our genre is a little different than other genres. I don't know if the other genres have this kind of almost mentor-student relationship, but these people really mean it. So, and that's kind of the spirit for why he started the contest. Pay it forward, contribute to the whole, make the world a better place.
Yeah. It's interesting because even in his youth, because a lot of these essays that you read in the workshop, those are essays he wrote in the 30s and 40s, published in the Writer's Digest and those magazines to help aspiring writers. And C.L. Moore, who was one of the Golden Age authors,
Right.
there's a book we have called Letters and Journals with Mr. Hubbard, and she wrote this most endearing letter to Ron Hubbard, helping her, as a writer, and they had maintained, friendship over the years. She was one of the first judges
Okay.
for the contest. But you see so many of these artists and judges that were on board at the get-go that were his peers, and then it continues on. So it is a definite paying forward. We're now 40 years down the road,
Right.
and I mean his first materials were published in the early 1920s, so it's been almost a century.
Yeah.
That he's been an author, but it's just I don't know if I've heard it's more in science fiction and fantasy than any other genre, that sense of paying it forward, putting it there for the future, generation of artists and for writers. But it was the last genre he wrote in, and I honestly think that, because he says in the first volume, first Writers of Future volume, said a culture is as rich and as capable of surviving as it has imaginative artists. The artist is looked upon to start things. The artist injects the spirit of life into a culture. And nothing does that better than science fiction and fantasy. Envisioning
Right.
and conceiving these new realities, these new worlds. Some are, are exciting, some are scary. You know, like I asked about the cautionary tales, you know, on a small scale, but on a large scale too, it says things, okay, if, you know, we're seeing who got it right on the AI, you know, because it's been being talked about for half a century at least. So, but you take a look in the contest, what we've had is, I mean, such amazing from the start of you mentioned Zelazny, but Jack Williamson, John Varley, Theodore Sturgeon, Bob Silverberg, Charles Sheffield, Jerry Purnell. These are all past judges. Andre Norton, Larry Niven, C.L. Moore, and McCaffrey. Frank Herbert was a judge, now his son is a judge. Hal Clement, Scott Card, Ramsey Campbell, Algis Budrus, Ben Bova. You know, and then we have several of the judges that are still with us on the writer's side. And on the art side, Ed Cartier, Vincent DeFate, Diane and Leo Dillon. Leo passed away. Diane's still alive. She still judges, and they're in New York. Will Eisner's got his own award now at Comic-Con. Frank Frazetta was a judge, one of the first judges. Frank Kelly Freeze, the original coordinating judge. Shun Kojima, Jack Kirby, Paul Lair, and Mobius, Alex Schomburg, H.R. Van Dongen, William R. Warren. These are all major names in science fiction fantasy culture. And they all came on board in support of Mr. Hubbard's vision. And so you're going to go out there now as a writer, and you're going to be an inspiration for others.
Hopefully.
Not hopefully, absolutely. You know, I'm speaking from experience. I've been doing this for longer than the year that you're experiencing it right now.
Yeah.
The fact that the number of people that always wanted to be a writer, and for whatever reason, I had one doctor, this is maybe 20 years ago, he'd always wanted to be a writer, but he just couldn't cut it, you know. So instead he became a medical doctor because that's something he could confront doing.
Right.
And he worked emergency room. And then when he won the grand prize, he told his story, you know, so then he transferred over to becoming a writer. But it's a scary proposition, you know, to do that. And so the idea of a second career as an author is absolutely possible. You entered how many times?
Just the one, actually.
So you're very much the exception to the rule, because some people up there on the stage last night have been.
But keep in mind, I mean, I have been writing for 40 years. So it's not like, it's easy. It's not easy.
Yeah.
But I just fell into it at the right time.
Yeah. That's good. And then for yourself, you said this was your second time that you entered?
Second time, correct.
Good, you know, but the number of people that, especially artists, that like, no, I'm not good enough. I can't do it. I'm not going to do this. It's really popular out there. And you know, as a mental condition of like, I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
You know, the imposter syndrome on both sides of the table, the writer and artist. So it's just it's something people need to deal with. So by listening to what you have to say, hopefully they'll say, okay, I will enter the worst that's going to happen is you'll get a letter or an email saying, thank you very much, submit again. And
they mean that, by the way, because they really do want to see your stories, see your efforts again.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. And even for the hardcore people like yourself, Dao, Joni's going to reach out to you and take you by the scruff of the neck and saying, submit again.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's been great having you both on. So for somebody to find you, Dao, where can they go find you on the website or on social media?
Yeah. So I guess you can just go on Google and type my name, Dao Vi, and
spell it.
His first name is DAO, last name is VI. And yeah, you can find me on Instagram. I post mostly my work on Instagram, but I also do a bit of ArtStation as well. But yeah, I'm sure if you type in my name, you'll be able to find me.
Great. And Dave?
Well, for one thing, I don't have a cool name like Dao Vi. But, well, at the moment, I really don't have much of a social presence, but this has obviously been brought home to me that, yes, I need a social presence. So I'll be bringing up a website pretty soon and doing the Facebook thing. So at the moment, you probably won't have any luck finding me.
Well, you will, because your name's listed on Rise to Feature Volume 39, which will be found on Goodreads. You'll be able to find your name there, and they'll find your name on Amazon as an Amazon author.
Okay.
That's going up as this book is published.
But anyway, so at some point here, I'll have a website, and I'm obviously got things in the works. So
Good. And so to begin with, you can find out at Writers of the Future, Volume 39. And everybody needs to get and read this book. If you're an aspiring writer or artist, this shows you how good you have to be in order to make it to this level and for this market. And if you love good science fiction and fantasy, this is the book to read because that's what it is.
It's a good read. And like John's saying, if you want to know about the contest, read the book.
Great.
Awesome.
Great. And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. Writers of the Future series can be purchased wherever books are sold in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and South Africa, and available everywhere via Amazon.com. We're especially appreciative of our sponsor, Carnation, for supporting this podcast. Carnation has been making delicious milk products for over a century and is still going strong. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Dave and Dao.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, I thank you very much. I would also appreciate if you took a moment to follow it on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcast. Today is one of the most special podcasts I do each year, where I'm able to interview the grand prize winners of the Writers and Illustrators of the Future contest. This year it's for Volume 39. And so I'd like to welcome as the grand prize writer winner, David Henrickson, and the grand prize illustrator winner, Dao Vi. Welcome, gentlemen.
Pleasure meeting you.
Yep. Good to be here.
All right. So I got all kinds of questions. So we'll just start off. So Dave or David?
Either one. I normally go by Dave.
Okay, good. So Dave, so can you give me your trajectory as a writer? Because a lot of people listening to stuff here who maybe are on the second
Second career?
career
Yes.
part of life,